and a very warm welcome to everyone at EWJ Podcast, where we sit with educators across the globe to discuss up-to-date approaches of the themes in focus, followed by some actionable tips and secrets of the trade. That will be inspiring for our listeners and help them to enhance their teaching and learning experience. Your host today is Maria Zahir, and in this episode, we are talking about from teacher to an ELT writer, top tips to get started. And our guest today is Ethan Mansour. Welcome, Ethan. How are you?
Hi, how are you, Maria?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for joining us today, Ethan. We're honored to have you at the platform.
Honored to be here.
Thank you. So Ethan is an ELT material writer and teacher based in Spain. Recent publication includes the Teacher's Book for Ready for B2 First and Ready for C1 Advanced Macmillan Education, as well as the resource book activity for mediation, building bridges in the ELT classroom, Delta Publications. He's currently teaching at International House Madrid, where he participates in the professional development programs. He has an MA in Applied Linguistics and TESOL from University of Leicester. Well, thank you, Ethan. And that was an impressive bio that we have just heard. So, Ethan, I think you are just the right person to talk about ELT writing because you've been a writer. So since how long have you been doing this? Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
So not that long, actually. The first materials I did, materials writing I did was about 3 years ago, actually. Mm-hmm. And before that, I was just, a teacher. I've worked mostly in private language schools, like International House. And although I have done some work in sort of public schools, but mostly in the sort of the private sector in these sort of private language schools.
Great, that's nice. So how did life take you to Spain?
Well, so I'm American, and in the United States, everybody studies Spanish, basically. The second language most people learn at school. But I didn't succeed in learning very much of it, to be honest. And I was kind of a bit disappointed by that, and I really wanted to learn another language, and Spanish seemed like a good place to start because I did have some background in Spanish. So yeah, that's what brought me to Spain. I was interested in learning Spanish primarily, and teaching English was an easy job to get here, relatively speaking. And that's sort of how I got started. And I basically decided that I really liked teaching and that this is what I wanted to do. I lived here in Spain for a while, and then I went and lived in Italy for a while, about 5 years, and then I came back to Spain. That's right.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you for sharing that, Ethan. So let's get back to our main topic. So what do you think is the scope of ELT writing these days in terms of seeking a job or in terms of pursuing it as a career?
So the thing to understand about materials writing is essentially a freelance job. Sort of hard to get a full-time job as like a content writer or creator. I think those jobs do exist, certainly, but I think they're relatively rare. So, if you want to write for a big publisher like Macmillan or something, it's usually freelance work. They have work that they need to get done, and they find writers to do it for them. And if you're lucky enough to get contacted and you're a right fit for the job, then they give you the work. But in terms of sort of as a career, you just kind of have to build up enough contacts and enough experience to kind of guarantee yourself work. But yeah, that's basically how it works. Publishers have books they need to write, and they need writers to write them, and they find the right people, basically.
Okay, interesting. So, for example, if I'm interested to become an ELT writer, like you said, you have to contact the publishers or anything, but do you think my teaching experience is good enough or my qualifications are good enough? Is there any setting stone or something that I need to do before I contact them?
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing about ELT materials writing. There really isn't a lot you can do to get kind of ready for it and get qualified. There are certain master's programs. There's one with Nile. And there are sort of, courses you can do in materials writing, certainly. But it's not easy to get kind of trained up in that sense. There isn't like a CELTA or a Delta program for materials writing. And actually, it's kind of surprising that materials writing isn't included in more sort of master's programs or sort of certificate or diploma courses like the CELTA or the Delta, because in reality, most teachers do create materials, right? That's kind of part of our job.
Yes.
A lot of teachers actually have to write tests and stuff, which is quite hard and requires a certain amount of knowledge and skills. Which they usually don't have because nobody sort of taught them how to do it. Is that something you had to do, Maria? Have you had to sort of write tests?
Oh, yes, we do contribute to our, course examination. So we have to contribute to the different items we are assigned to for different skills. And lesson planning, of course. So lesson planning also prepares you for ELT writing, isn't it? It doesn't have to be an article. So what I perceive, what people know, that ELT writing means just writing for a course book. So can you expand on that? So what does ELT writing branches out to different kinds of things? For me, lesson planning, writing a lesson plan is also ELT writing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that,
also ELT writing. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed what you said. I was interrupting.
I'm sorry. Sorry. So for me, ELT writing means also lesson planning, right? So lesson planning itself is ELT writing. And what else do you think is covered under this?
Yeah, I might just caveat that, say that I'm not sure lesson planning itself is ELT writing, but if you're creating something for your class, that would certainly constitute as ELT writing. So for example, if you're working with a course book, but you find an interesting video to introduce the topic with, or kind of add some type of game or activity, that's certainly materials writing. I mean, if you were writing a lesson plan that was going to be published or shared within your school, that could certainly count as materials writing as well. But yeah, in terms of sort of the variety of things you can do, you can write for apps. There are a lot of sort of language learning apps out there that need content. You can write for websites. There are a lot of sort of subscription type of websites nowadays that teachers subscribe to, and then they have access to sort of a library of materials. And materials that students, that teachers can get access to with a fee. And of course, there are also free materials as well that teachers sort of produce and publish either on their own websites or on these other sort of free to download type of materials websites that are out there. So yeah, I mean, all of that is certainly materials writing. I think when you think of materials writing, you think of sort of course books, but actually, there's a lot out there. There are YouTubers, for example, that are creating sort of video content for students or teachers. All of that sort of falls into the category of materials writing. So sort of what you end up doing can be very different from project to project,
Right. So what is the starting point then, Mansur? So what do you think, Ethan, is the starting point of an ELT writer? Well, okay, I want to start contributing from tomorrow, for example, and I need some starting point. So, for example, I have like 15 years of teaching experience, right? So is it good enough to be an ELT writer? Do I have to really prove that I'm qualified enough and make an impact in the contribution of my ELT writing?
So the short answer to that question is no. Just being a teacher sort of doesn't prepare you for being a materials writer, unfortunately. It's a prerequisite for materials writing, certainly. It would be sort of impossible to write ELT materials if you didn't have a background in teaching. A background in sort of teacher training, I think, is particularly helpful for it because that means you sort of observed other teachers teaching and stuff. But yeah, materials writing, it's of course related to sort of classroom teaching, but it requires a whole sort of body of knowledge and a number of skills that you really need to be able to develop in order to do it sort of successfully, in order to do it well. Of course, as we said before, teachers are sort of creating materials all the time. But that doesn't mean they're very good. They might work in their individual class, but that doesn't mean that they could sort of work for the whole country or even for the whole school. Creating materials that sort of are going to work on a larger scale is much more challenging. You just have to know how to do certain things, like write multiple choice questions, which is a quite technical sort of skill. That 15 years of teaching experience is just not going to give you, unfortunately. So I think if you were talking about a starting point, I think a great starting point is kind of studying materials. So like if you have materials that you use and you like if you have a course book that you like, or if there's a website that you like a lot, or even a YouTuber, sort of studying it, sort of trying to ask yourself sort of what makes it good? Why do I like using this? Why does it work in my classroom? How is it structured? That kind of thing. I think I've learned a lot from studying sort of good writing, and when you think about it, like, this is what all good writers do, right? They read and good musicians listen to a lot of music. And so I think that's a good starting point, sort of maybe trying to study the materials you have and maybe using that as a starting point, maybe trying to replicate them on a different topic, or trying to adapt them to your particular sort of teaching context and your students' needs. I think that's a great place to start. And I think a second place to start is actually reading some books about materials writing. As I said, there's just a sort of knowledge that you need to learn in order to do it well. And that is available to us in books. There's a nice one, which I think is a great place to start, called ETpedia Materials Writing. Published by Pavilion, and the authors Lindsay Clanfield and John Hughes. They're sort of established, well-known coursebook writers. And they've sort of written a book that's kind of like materials writing for dummies, as if you had never done it before, which is really helpful because some of it is going to be super obvious, having been a teacher for a while, but other things are not as obvious as you might think, So, for example, like we were talking about multiple choice questions, sort of how do you actually write that kind of thing? And there are certain rules to it. For example, like some of the answers can't be a lot longer because that's going to make it very easy for the students to guess the right answer. So there's just stuff like that you need to learn. A book like that is a great place to start. And then sort of once you get a little bit better and once you get a little bit more confident, there's sort of a whole series of books that are published by ELT Publishing Professionals. It's called ELT Teacher to Writer. And those books are also written for basically people who have never written any kind of ELT materials before. And they have sort of separate books, sort of short books on writing, speaking activities, writing grammar activities. And I found those very, very helpful. Because as I said before, there's just not a lot of kind of courses out there you can take. You kind of have to go out there and find that information yourself. But I think those, that ETpedia book and the ELT Teacher to Writer series are a great place to start. Sort of learning about the craft, because it's a craft. It's just like teaching. There's a lot to learn.
But I think as a teacher as well, when we also plan and go to a classroom, we know our gut feeling tells it didn't work that well as we had planned, isn't it? So that can be also kind of a reflection or a starting point. So I had written this, or I had created this worksheet, and I had this YouTube video to go with it as a reflection, but it didn't work well as I had planned. So do you think that can also help in reflecting where I stand? Because I know we do have that feeling, we just don't show it, do we?
No, I think that's another good starting place, actually, when you think about it. If you teach something and it doesn't work, so trying to fix it, trying to think about how it could have been better. Why weren't the students very interested in discussing this particular question, or why did they find this one particularly hard to answer, or why did they find this one so easy? I think that could be another nice starting point. Or, for example, if you're using a course book or some kind of published material that you don't like, that you don't think is very good for some reason, or it just doesn't really fit your context, trying trying to make it fit your context. That's a good exercise. Absolutely.
Great, thank you. So what are the latest trends in ELT writing then, Ethan? So they're more skills-based, or they're academic, or ESP, or just more for, communicative language teaching?
Yeah, so there's sort of a few things going on right now in ELT. I think one thing that I've noticed in the last few years is there's been a sort of a stronger concentration on sort of soft skills, or 21st century skills, as they're called. Trying to incorporate things like critical thinking and problem solving sort of into the ELT classroom, which I think is a good thing. And I think that type of class sort of based around critical thinking or problem solving can be very interesting and engaging for students. A good way for them to practice their English. So I see that happening a lot in course books and in sort of ELT materials more generally. Another thing I see is kind of like this globalization of English and sort of the recognition that English isn't just something that's spoken in England and America.
Yeah.
There are lots and lots of people that speak English as a first language that don't live there. They live in very different parts of the world. And there are certainly, millions and millions of people who use English around the world as a second language that will never visit England or America and aren't particularly interested in those places. And so I think that a lot of materials nowadays are focusing on that of sort of how do people actually use English out, sort of out in the world, and that oftentimes they're using it to talk to business partners in other countries, or they're using it in some kind of intercultural or international setting. So when I see sort of course books nowadays, they're not so full of sort of Big Ben and the Statue of Liberty. There still is that, of course, particularly kind of kids' books and stuff, but much less than before. I think, a perfect example of this is pronunciation. So if you look at sort of newer course books that are coming out right now, you'll notice that there's been a huge shift away from kind of like the native speaker as the target. So sort of pronunciation teaching isn't nowadays sort of in a modern course book isn't about sort of imitating a British accent, for example. It's about being intelligible and being sort of easy to understand, which are two very different things when you think about it. And obviously being really easy to understand is much more important if you're using English kind of out there in the world than it is, parroting a sort of a British accent, you know what I mean?
True. Yeah, exactly. So those trends. So also post-pandemic and unfortunately lots of, war driven, have got lots of refugees to different countries as well. And I have noticed there are new trends as well going towards, we have very less material welcoming refugees, like making them, it's a sensitive topic, right? So when we go in to find resources for them to, just if I'm given a class to teach them tomorrow, I don't have a starting point. Although, we have few, but not as much. So do you think also post-pandemic, online teaching has become a biggest challenge these days? Some are still doing hybrid teaching and some are still online. And so the trends have changed in that way?
That's another big trend that I was going to mention, that there's basically ELT materials have to be able to be used online now.
Yeah.
Basically. If you're going to publish a course book, you better have an online, like an ebook version. You better have a website. You better have like a classroom presentation tool that you could use on a program like Zoom. I don't think publishers, they just don't make materials that can't be used online at this point. So that's another big shift, to be sure. Because in an interesting way, that already existed before the pandemic, but teachers just never used it. They just didn't have to, they didn't have to teach online. So whatever, I'm not going to use this, I'm not going to use this like whiteboard tool or whatever. I can just teach. But I think now we've all had to use those because we've all been teaching online. So I think that sort of the market and the desire for that kind of material, sort of digitalized materials, is much greater than before, for sure.
Yeah, but it's sad though, isn't it? Because they was lying there, shoved in the shelf somewhere. Because if we were already in 21st century, why did a pandemic had to come to push us out of our comfort zone and try their digital tools? Because Quizlet and Kahoot has been there since ages. Everybody goes back to those two apps, and there are hundreds of others as well, similar to that. And so I think it was already neat at that time to start things.
Yeah. Yeah, right. we all had to get trained up with that kind of thing very quickly, and I think we all made a lot of discoveries along the line. I certainly had never used Kahoot before.
Yeah,
I never used Mentimeter or any of these sort of things that I do use now, even in person classes.
And they're not very hard to use, isn't it? They're not very hard to use. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's lots of things that work just fine in a face-to-face lesson. They're great, sort of. But it took kind of the pandemic to raise our awareness of that kind of thing.
Yes. So, I know you are an experienced writer, ELT writer. So, in your experience, what are the top tips you might have for the new ELT writers, or who are really interested in taking up as part of their career? Yeah.
So, as I mentioned before, I think that you have to sort of think of it as a craft, think about something that you can get better at. And starting by studying materials and reading about materials writing, I think that's a great place to start. But as I said sort of at the beginning, this is essentially freelance work. So most materials writing, you sort of don't get to do it until someone asks you to do it. You can be full of great ideas, but if nobody's sort of asked you to write materials, then you don't get to write them. Unless of course you're just writing for your own students, which is perfectly fine. So ways to kind of get noticed by publishers. There's sort of a variety of things you can do. I kind of took the old-fashioned route, which is basically starting to speak at conferences. Mm-hmm. And I started writing articles for sort of ELT magazines and blogs, and that created some what they call visibility for myself. Mm-hmm. And that led to people contacting me, essentially. And that's sort of how a lot of sort of coursebook writers and people have gotten into materials writing. They sort of are participating in kind of the community of practice around them, whether it be sort of in their own school or in their own sort of country and in sort of teaching organizations, things like that. But I know that there's sort of other ways to do that now, sort of get into materials writing. As some people start writing their own materials and they create their own website and they start sort of publishing those materials on LinkedIn and other places like that. And if teachers like them and they start really using them, that creates a lot of visibility for you as well. So, and also kind of gives you a resume. In a sense, if you sort of have never written anything before, it's kind of hard to get a job or sort of get noticed. But if you have actually written quite a bunch of stuff and teachers seem to actually be using it and it's good quality, you can actually show that to a publisher that might be interested in working with you. There are other ways too, like. Publishers are always looking for teachers to review materials, new coursebook materials and stuff like that. So sort of getting in touch with publishers, whether it be through like the representative, sort of a sales representative that comes to your school, or perhaps the director of studies at your school, sort of just letting them know that you've interested in that kind of work. I know that, there's sort of materials writers that I know that have gotten started that way as well. They sort of reviewed things and publishers thought that they had a good eye for sort of materials and ask them to, write some worksheets or write whatever it is they needed to do. That can be another way to get started as well. But I think the idea of kind of visibility is sort of important because, as I said, they sort of have to know who you are in order to offer you work. Having some type of contacts, whether it be contacts through LinkedIn or Facebook. For example, I have a materials writing friend who did like a LinkedIn search for like development editors. And just tried to make friends with like every single development editor at every single publisher. That kind of thing makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because those people are going to see your posts or something, and
of course, yeah.
And maybe that guy could write something for us or something.
Interesting. That's very interesting. So it's all about connections then.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yes.
And one reason why I've been successful is I've had contacts. I work at a very big school. We have like over 100 teachers at my school, and a lot of people who have worked for my school in the past have moved into publishing, and so I got very lucky, and I mean, they wouldn't have been offering me work if I couldn't do it. but yeah, I started off with some contacts actually, which were very helpful to me and continue to be helpful. So yeah, I think making that kind of contact is important, whether it be through a school like International House where I work, or through social media or through other meetings.
And I think most important is, Ethan, that you should have that natural flair in yourself, isn't it? Even for being a teacher, I say you are born teacher. Nobody can make you a teacher. For me, a Celta or Delta cannot make you a good teacher. You should have that passion in you. You should have that. And this has to be a spark, isn't it?
I think to be really good at it, yes. I think that I might disagree about sort of being born a teacher. I think to be like an amazing teacher, yes, that's probably something you're born with. But I think teaching is a craft. I think just about anybody can become relatively good at it. And I think that's true with materials writing as well. If you work hard enough at it, I'm sure anybody can do it. However, I think doing it really well is difficult, and I think it requires some creativity, as you said, sort of maybe a personal flair, being interested in certain things. But for example, I was very interested in something called mediation, and I think that gave me kind of a different angle. It gave me a niche. I mean, I thought that's another kind of maybe a good advice, is to kind of, at least at the beginning, maybe try to specialize in something. And so if you're kind of an expert at pronunciation or teaching Lexis or something, that might lead to some materials writing related to that niche. All those things kind of make sense, I think.
Thank you so much, Ethan. I'm afraid we have ran out of time, and we had some interesting conversations, and I'm sure our listeners will learn a lot from your input through this podcast. And if they wish to be an ELT writer soon, they will have some great tips and books to read from your advice here. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we are honored and happy to have you at our platform today.
Well, nice talking to you, and best of luck with your platform. It's very, very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you so much.